couple of things about the sin offering. We assume, or we think, maybe I should say, that this had to do with sins against things in the temple, because when they offered a sacrifice, that was what was cleansed, was the parts of the temple, whether it be the holy place, the outer court, the altar. So we're looking at it from that standpoint. We talked about how that the temple was the place where God lived. So that's an important part about it, is that it needed to be cleaned or purified. The sins in this section were generally mentioned as being out of ignorance or not knowing about them, unintentional. We covered if the high priest sinned, what was supposed to happen. He was supposed to offer a bull. If the congregation sinned, then the elders, and this is probably the precursor to the synagogue. It was like the people that Moses selected to help with the taking care of all the judgments that needed to be done between the children of Israel in the wilderness. And we believe that's who this was and what eventually became the synagogue. And we noticed that it then went on to the prince, what many translations say prince or ruler, and we believe those were the heads of the 12 tribes. And then lastly, it was individuals, and all of these offered each time, it seems, a smaller sacrifice as we're going through that. And we had gotten through that, and I wanted to get to the last section, which talks about 3 different types of specific sins. And if you'll turn over to Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 1, we'll talk about the first type of sin. Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 1. And if anyone sin in that he heareth the voice of adjuration, he being a witness, whether he hath seen or known, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. Now, this translations give us a little bit different flavor here, and especially in stuff like this, I recommend as you study, you look at several different translations. So let me read that in the English Standard Version, and you'll see a couple of differences here. If anyone sins in that he hears a public adjuration to testify, and though he is a witness, whether he has seen or come to know the matter, yet does not speak, he shall bear his iniquity. And the King James is close to that. I'll read from the New King James. And if a person sins in hearing the utterance of an oath, and is a witness, whether he has seen or known of the matter, if he does not tell it, he bears the guilt. So what's he talking about here? If he's witness to an oath and he comes to know about it or doesn't know about it, what's he trying to say? If you look over in Exodus chapter 22, and this is one of the things that we'll touch on a little bit later, is that a lot of these things that we talk about in here, we get some fairly condensed comments about it. And we can sometimes see in other places a more specific example of what he's talking about, or one that fits the circumstance. There may have been others. So over in Exodus chapter 22, in verse 10, starting in verse 10, we read of an example where the law was given, where it's a little bit more specific, something like this. If a man deliver unto his neighbor an ass or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep, and it die or be hurt or be driven away, no man seeing it, the oath of Jehovah shall be between the two of them, whether he hath not put his hand to his neighbor's good, and the owner thereof shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. So we see here what's happening is somebody has loaned, in this case, an animal to somebody, and something has happened to it. And this is in a section that is talking about, okay, if something happens to something and you kill somebody's ox or something, then you have to make restitution for it. And so what he's saying here is, in the middle of this, he says that if something's happened to it and nobody saw what happened, then they make an oath to the owner, and he doesn't have to pay restitution. He says, no, I didn't do it. It happened. It's gone, but I didn't have any part of it. In other words, he didn't steal his neighbor's animal, or he didn't kill it, or sell it, or something like that. So going back to Leviticus, the concept here is, okay, if somebody makes an oath and you had seen and you didn't say something, you're guilty. You're considered guilty. So that's kind of the context, or one example of how this would apply. So we're seeing here that as a witness that doesn't speak up, he's saying you're guilty of the same thing. And, we think about how does this apply today? Well, we have a little bit of that same responsibility. What we do and what we say and how things work like that. The second one in Leviticus chapter 5, verses 2 and 3, excuse me, we've talked briefly before about clean and unclean, and we'll get more into that as we get to the rules of it. But here it says, once again, under the section talking about the sin sacrifice or the trespass sacrifice, where it's generally talking about trespassing against things in the temple. And it says, if anyone touch anything unclean, whether it be the carcass of an unclean beast, or the carcass of an unclean cattle, or the carcass of an unclean creeping things, and it be hidden from him, and he be unclean, then he shall be guilty. Now I want to stop there because once again, the different translations help us out a lot. One thing that we want to be careful about is reading too much into some things. If you look at, say, the English Standard Version, it says, or if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean wild animal, or carcass of an unclean livestock, or carcass of unclean swarming things, and it is hidden from him, he has become unclean, and he realizes his guilt. So there's a concept in here of the difference between realizing your guilt and what you do. It's real easy to misread this and think that you're not guilty until you realize your guilt. But we'll see in some other passages today where that's not the case. You're guilty whether you realize it or not. But what it's talking about here is somebody that, for example, let's say I had touched something that was unclean. What does that do to me? Makes me unclean. Now, I go into the temple. What have I done? I have made the temple unclean. And so it needs to be purified or cleansed. And that's what these sin offerings were about. Because when they offered something, the blood was sprinkled either in the holy place and or out at the altar in the courtyard, depending upon who was the one that was making the offering. So we see this type of a concept here, but I want to make a big point is that the guilt is there. The guilt may not be the right word. We are guilty. Sometimes when we use the word guilt today, we think of the feeling we have. We feel guilty about something. Now, this is talking about the judgment. You are guilty compared to just feeling guilty. So it goes on, it says, if he... Let's continue this. It says, or if he touches the uncleanliness of a man, or whatsoever his uncleanliness be, whether he is unclean or it be hid from him, when he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty. He shall realize his guilt, is the concept here. When he realizes his guilt is when he does something about it. The idea here is, if I do something and I'm not aware of it, under the old law, When I come to be aware of it, I need to do something about it. I go and make a sacrifice. Think back to Job. He offered daily sacrifices for his sons. Why? In case they had sinned. And they didn't know it. So you see these types of things kind of go through. And Job was before this, supposedly, we believe anyway, his time was before the Mosaic Law, and yet they were doing this type of thing then anywhere. And the last section here is if somebody swears an oath. It says, if anyone swear rashly with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatsoever it be, that a man shall utter rashly with an oath, and it be hid from him, when he knoweth of it, he shall be guilty, or he will realize his guilt in one of these things. Okay. How do you utter an oath and not know it? We are supposed to let our word be yes or no and not make oaths on things that we don't control. That is true. This, I think, is once again in the Old Testament, oaths were something that they made. So, for instance, we just talked about a case where somebody had somehow or another been involved with an animal of someone else's, and they made an oath to the owner that they didn't have anything to do with it. So, and that was what they were supposed to do. So, oaths in this sense weren't always bad, but it does mention here a rash oath. Who do we remember in the Bible with the rash oath? Jephthah. Jephthah made a rash oath. When did he know it was a rash oath when he made it? No, he didn't realize it until his daughter came out of the house to meet him. And then he realized what his problem was, that he had done something. So it's not always something we know about at the time, but the concept here is when you know it, when you realize your guilt, you do something about it. And that still applies to us today. When we realize we've done something wrong, we need to do something about it. So just quickly to read the last section in this. And it shall be when he shall be guilty of one of these things that he shall confess that wherein he hath sinned, and he shall bring his trespass offering to Jehovah for his sin which he hath sinned, a female from the flock, a ram or a lamb or a goat, for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. And if his means suffice not a lamb, then he shall bring a trespass offering for that wherein he hath sinned, 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and unto Jehovah, one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. And he shall bring them unto the priest, who shall offer that which is for the sin offering first, and wring off its head from its neck, but shall not divide it asunder. And he shall sprinkle the blood of the sin offering upon the side of the altar, once again implying here that the altar needed to be cleansed. Not exactly sure why, but that is the implication there. The sin offering, that he should offer the second burnt offering according to the ordinance, and the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin, wherein he has sinned, and he shall be forgiven. But, once again, if his means not suffice for the 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, then he shall bring his oblation for that wherein he hath sinned, a 10th part of an ephah of fine flour. And it goes on to talk about the offering of the flour or a grain offering, and it even specifies like the grain offering. So with these sins, it's interesting that when it gets down to these 3 sins at the bottom, or these 3 types of sins, that an individual was able to get forgiveness of sins even if they didn't have the means for a lamb. So even the poor could be forgiven of their sins. So one of the things that is mentioned in here, in some versions, the last section talks about he shall bring to the priest his compensation, which literally is translating more like his guilt price, which makes us think that in a lot of cases there was this sin offering and also a guilt offering. But guilt offerings are different from sin offerings, and we know this for a couple of reasons. One is that the offering is different, and we'll see that in just a minute. The guilt offering has a very specific offering, and it is different from the offerings from the sin offering. And secondly, the guilt offering requires a 20% additional payment. It requires restitution and 20% or a fifth more. So let's look at we'll be looking at Leviticus chapter 5, verse 14, starting in verse 14. And there's three different types in the sin offering. It started off talking about if the anointed priest sins, if the congregation sins, if the ruler sins, and if an individual sins. And then it talked about the different offerings. In the earlier ones, most of the time it was talking about, okay, if the offering is from the herd, then it would be a cattle of this, that, different ones were different. So here it actually starts off saying, hey, if you've done this, if you're guilty of this, then this is the offering. So this is applying a little bit more. The first one is sins against holy things. And this goes back to where we were with the sin offering. And I'm sorry, my brain I have to stop and think which one I'm talking about. But it says, Jehovah spake unto Moses, verse 14 of chapter 5. And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, if anyone commit a trespass and sin unwittingly, once again, we're talking about, hey, I didn't recognize this at the time, in the holy things of Jehovah. So once again, we're talking about the things, most likely the things having to do with worship. Then he shall bring his trespass offering unto Jehovah, a ram without blemish, out of the flock, according to thy estimation in silver by shekels, after the shekel of the sanctuary, for a trespass offering. Now, this is another one where if you read different versions, you see a slightly different flavor. That was the ASV. If you go to the English Standard Version, then it says, he shall offer a ram without blemish out of the flock, valued in the silver shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. So you can very easily see that one version is saying, okay, the ram appears to be saying the ram is supposed to equal the valuation of the restitution that you need. And then a little bit later it says plus a fifth. So what is it here? And you can read a lot of different versions, and they are all somewhere between those two of you bring a ram with the value in shekels, or you bring the ram and the value with shekels, in shekels. And that actually makes more sense in the context, because you're saying, okay, we're bringing a ram in, and we will see when it gets down into a different set into the third set here, that if somebody sins, then they bring not only the offering, but they pay restitution plus a fifth. It gets more specific in the third section here. So we kind of assume that's the same thing here. So don't get confused about the valuation being the valuation of the ram. I believe it really was a ram for God for the guilt offering and the restitution. Yes, sir. Yes, it would get very expensive, and it was something that was not supposed to stop. It was something that, remember we said this was something that would be continual. So yes, it would be very expensive, and we relate that to today in the cost of our salvation. While we can't make a lot of one-to-one correlations between these sacrifices and the sacrifice of Christ, there are a lot of things we can say, oh, that reminds me of this. And that helps us a lot to see what was going on. And the cost of this is one of those things that, oh, this was costly. This was something that took up a large part of their life. They were careful about it. And have you ever noticed that when something, what's the easiest way to learn a lesson? When it's painful. Like, it hurts when I stub my toe again. Stop stubbing your toe. Well, that's one way we learn the lesson. And with Christ, we don't always feel that pain today. So that's something we can learn by looking at this is, yes, it was expensive. Yes, Christ, the valuation here is way out of sync, it seems like. But that's what it cost. So that's a very important point there. Sure. Hopefully I'll have an answer.
So every time a person sins, they take their offering to the priest, and the priest is the one who's doing the actions, right? Like as an individual, am I ever going to?
Okay, well, if you go back to the earlier offerings that we talked about, they were very specific on, let's say on the burnt offering, the person making the offering would kill the beast. And he would skin the beast, or flay it, as some versions say. And I don't remember whether he cut it up or the priest cut it up, but the priest would put it on the altar and arrange it. So there were certain parts.
Do this in my tent.
No, and it was always on the altar as well.
I have the second part to what Zach was saying about how it would be expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So is that perhaps why they brought in verse 7? If you're poor and can't afford the lamb, you should do the first.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that is also something that would cut down with the expense of the, poor people who make their offerings.
Yeah, that's a good question. And with the sin offering, once again, this was something that we believe was a sin against a holy thing. And holy things, trying to compare holy things then like the lampstand and the tabernacle and the holy things of God like that to today gets a little confusing. But once again, this was something that needed to be cleansed. So with the guilt offering, there seems to be a restitution portion, in other words, making it right, plus the sacrifice itself would be for an atonement, and the person making the sacrifice would be forgiven. Did that answer your question? Okay. So this second section talks about doing things against the Lord, sinning against the commandments of God. Now, what does that cover? Let me rephrase that. What does that not cover? Okay? If anyone sins doing any of the things that the Lord's commandments ought not be done, though he did not know it, then realizes his guilt, he shall bear his iniquity. He shall bring to the priest a ram, once again, without blemish out of the flock, or its equivalent for a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him for the mistake that he made unintentionally, and he shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He has indeed incurred guilt before the Lord. A couple things remind you, it's not that we're not guilty before we realize it. We're guilty whether we realize it or not. They were guilty whether they realized it or not. The question here is, what do you do when you realize it? You make the sacrifice. Okay? So here, it's a commandment against God. The first one was against the holy things. The second one is, hey, you broke a commandment of God. You're guilty. You may not have known it at the time. But when you realize it, oh, I need to go make this offering. Why? Why would they need to make the offering? because they were guilty. And that's an important part. Remember, we started this talking about part of the reason, I believe anyway, why these laws were given was because these people were trying to learn to live with God in the center of their midst. The tabernacle was in the center of the camp. The smoke and the fire were there. And, they kept doing things like murmuring and getting punished for it. How do you live with a perfect God? And that's the same type of thing we have to learn to deal with. Because God, what's the temple now? We are the temple of God. God lives within us. What happens when we become unclean? What happens when we break God's laws? We need forgiveness. So anyway, that's the type of thing we can learn. And the last section, well, let me check my notes, see if I'm leaving out anything. The last section, starting in chapter 6, verse 1, talks about dealing with our neighbors. And this is the only one in this section that really doesn't come out and say unintentional. Okay? So that's an interesting note to this. And Jehovah spake to Moses, saying, if anyone sin and commit a trespass against Jehovah. Now, we're talking about when we sin against our neighbors, but it says that this is a trespass against Jehovah as well. And deal falsely with his neighbor in the matter of a deposit or of a bargain or a robbery, or have oppressed his neighbor, or have found that which is lost and dealt falsely therein, and swear to a lie, in any of these things that a man doeth, sinning therein, then it shall be, if he hath sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore that which he took by robbery, or the thing that he had gotten by opposition, or the deposit which was committed to him, or the lost thing which was found, or anything about which he hath sworn falsely. He shall even restore it in full, and shall add a fifth part more thereunto. Unto him to whom it pertaineth shall he give it. In the day of his being found guilty. And once again, that being found guilty in some versions says realize he's guilty. So we're not, it doesn't say unintentionally, but it still has a little of that in it. Anyway, in the day that he realizes he's guilty, and the day that his guilt is made known, however you want to read that, and he shall bring his trespass offering unto Jehovah, a ram without blemish out of the flock, according to thy estimation, for a trespass offering unto the priest, and the priest shall make atonement for him before Jehovah, and he shall be forgiven concerning whatsoever he doeth, so as to be guilty thereby. Now, a couple of questions about this that I want you to think about. Look in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 1. Talks about if a man takes his neighbor's ox, what does he pay? $5 oxen for the ox. Where did the 5% come from? What's the difference between these two? It appears, and this is what general thinking more than I absolutely know, that the difference is between, oh, I realize I messed up and I'm going to fix it, and being caught. In other words, oh, I killed somebody's oxen and I'm caught, I have to pay him back 5 times. Yes. Absolutely. And so, but the difference in the penalty appears to be whether or not I am saying, oh, I messed up, I need to go fix that, and oh, I've done something and I've been caught, now I have to pay 5 times rather than just a fifth or more. So there is difference. Yes, sir. Yes. Mm-hmm. And we do that today in law. One of the nice things about being able to study the Old Testament, even though these laws don't directly apply to us, is we learn about God. We learn how God deals with people. And although this doesn't apply directly to us, it does help us understand that we're a whole lot better off when we confess rather than when we're beat over the head with it. So, yes, I agree with you. Well, that's true too. But in the same case here, sinning against our neighbors is also sinning against God. So that's something that we can see here that really does still apply today. Excuse me. Okay, that was one thing. Okay, in the guilt offering, what was the difference between that offering and the offerings, the rest of the offerings we talked about? The big difference was the restitution, or that was one of the differences anyway. In the other ones, an offering was made. In the guilt offering, restitution was made and an additional amount, on most of them anyway. The next thing I want to think about is the sacrifice. What's difference in the difference in the sacrifices? All the other ones seem to have varying sacrifices depending upon whether you were able to pay them, whether you were a ruler or just an individual, the effect you had on the rest of the people. This one, every one of them was exactly the same. It was a ram without blemish. Okay? Now, when you think of a ram, what do you think? What's the first thing that comes to your head? Close to where I was headed, I did a Google search. Guess what came up? Big horns, that's not what came up, but that's true. They do have horns. What comes up when you do a Google search for the word ram? Dodge truck. Football team, okay. What came up was Dodge truck. Wait a minute. Okay, let's think about this a minute. Why did Dodge name their truck Ram? Was there? No, we don't know, but just as a guess. It's tough. What's the difference between a sheep and a ram? Ram is a sheep. A ram is a sheep. Okay, so we think when we think in our head when we say ram, we think of a bigger, we think of big horns, tough. You know what the word in Hebrew means? It has nothing to do with ram. The word in Hebrew means pillar. Pillar, like a pillar that holds up the roof. A strong, the pillar of the herd. When it says a ram of the flock, it's a pillar of the flock, not herd, excuse me. Pillar of the flock. This is does that ring any bell? Does that make you think about this any different? And what does that remind us of today? Of Christ. He's the pillar and foundation of the church. So we can see a little bit of a correlation here. But this is for our guilt. Although the others make atonement and we're forgiven, this one is a guilt offering. And so I found that was to be a very interesting thing to learn about this specific offering, was that it very specifically says, I want the best part of your flock for this. I want the ram. You see what he's saying here? Last thing about this one. What is missing from the others what is missing from this one from the others? Other sacrifices. Now the blood is still used. It's splashed somewhere. I'll have to look. I forgot. But the blood is still used in the sacrifice. Both this one and the sin offering do not say they make a pleasing aroma to God. Why would that be? Absolutely. The other offerings, the burnt offering, we get confused a lot on different things. Burnt offering is one of them because they're all burnt. But the burnt offering was one that was a specific type. I should say they're all offered by fire. They're all burnt. But the burnt offering was one that was issued where somebody decides they want to honor God. They want to praise God for being who He is. And they bring their offering. There's not a command to bring it. It just says when you bring. If you bring, then this is what I want you to bring. The grain offering, we get confused on it because the Old King James calls it a meat offering. The New King James and several other versions call it a meal offering. It's really a grain offering. It's an offering of grain. But that's just a difference in the way we think about this type of thing. But it's the same with that one. It's when you bring me a grain offering. And the peace offering, once again, it was to make peace between you and God and between you and maybe your neighbors. But once again, it was a pleasing thing to God. It made a sweet aroma for Him. Was it the sacrifice that made the aromas? Was it the burning of the animal? No. And we know that because the animal was offered the same way in these last two, but it doesn't say it was the pleasing aroma. Is it pleasing to God that we are back, that we are forgiven? Absolutely. Is it pleasing to Him that we sinned? No. And so that's something that we need to learn to put into and think about in our lives today. Now, for next week, I wanted to introduce this a little bit more. For next week, before I get there, I got a couple of minutes. After studying these things, what are some things we can think about in our lives today? I want to remind you, we mentioned these. One is that there is a necessity in our lives for holiness. Hebrews 12:14 says, strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one can see the Lord. So we need to be holy, separated, set apart to God. That's something that I think, Daryl doesn't think enough about. And secondly, we need to remember sacrifice. These people lived with it day in and day out. It cost them. It was expensive. Romans 12:1 and 2, a passage you're all familiar with. Excuse me. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You see, we today are our sacrifice to God. Not a lamb, not a ram, but we ourselves are our sacrifice. For next week, we're going to study about the priesthood, Aaron and his sons. I want you to read for next week Exodus chapter 28 through 31. Yes, we're studying Leviticus. But the background for the next section, starting in chapter 8 of Leviticus, is based in Exodus chapter 28 through 31. Now, this is set when Moses is up on the mount receiving the law. Okay, he's given these instructions that are mentioned in Exodus 28 through 31, and it has to do with Aaron and his sons becoming priests. Now, what happens immediately after that, or while that is happening, while he's receiving this or immediately thereafter, what did Aaron do? He built the golden calf, and he denied that he did it. He said, I threw it in the stuff in the fire, and it came out a calf. Think about that and how God still made Aaron his high priest as we get ready for next week's lesson and how that applies to us. Thank you for your attention and your comments.